San Ysidro McDonald'S Massacre. 21 dead in America's deadliest fast food shooting on July 18, 1984. 21 people were shot to death inside a McDonald's restaurant in San Ysidro, California. All customers or employees, all there for a meal or a paycheck. The killing was methodical, systematic, a 77-minute massacre. The perpetrator wasn't a terrorist cell, wasn't an organized gang, wasn't even multiple shooters. He was James Oliver Huberty, a 41-year-old unemployed security guard who walked into a McDonald's with 3 firearms and told his wife he was going hunting for humans. Law enforcement would later call it the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't political ideology, wasn't racial hatred, wasn't even robbery gone wrong. It was untreated mental illness, paranoid delusions, and one man's decision that if his life was over, he'd take as many people with him as possible. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. San Ysidro sprawled across 7.5 square miles at the southernmost tip of San Diego, California. In 1984, population approximately 23,000, squeezed between Interstate 5 and the Mexican border. It was the kind of place where working-class families could still afford homes, where English and Spanish mixed freely in every conversation, and where the biggest employer was the border crossing that funneled tens of thousands of people between 2 countries daily. July in San Ysidro meant temperatures in the high 80s. Dry heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, mixed with exhaust fumes from the constant traffic heading to and from Mexico. The smell of street tacos from vendors near the border, mixed with fast food restaurants that lined San Ysidro Boulevard. At night, you could hear helicopters from Border Patrol. And when the wind blew north, you could smell the Tijuana River, a polluted waterway that marked the international boundary. But 1984 was a year of economic anxiety, even in sunny Southern California. The nation was recovering from the recession of the early 1980s, but recovery was uneven and slow for working-class communities. Unemployment remained stubbornly high in border towns like San Ysidro, where many residents worked in service industries or informal economy. Manufacturing jobs that had sustained previous generations were disappearing, replaced by minimum wage retail and fast food positions that couldn't support families. The McDonald's at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard represented both American prosperity and its limitations. It was a gleaming symbol of consumer culture, the golden arches visible from blocks away, promising fast, cheap food in a clean, air-conditioned environment. But the workers inside earned poverty wages. Many were teenagers getting their first jobs. Others were single mothers working multiple shifts to pay rent. The customers were families treating kids to happy meals, elderly couples nursing coffee, workers grabbing lunch between shifts at border crossings or nearby factories. San Ysidro's proximity to Mexico shaped everything about the community. Half the population was Mexican-American. Many families had relatives on both sides of the border. Spanish was as common as English in shops and schools. The border crossing at San Ysidro was the busiest land border crossing in the world, with 50,000 vehicles passing through daily. That constant flow created economic opportunity, jobs in customs and border patrol and tourism, but also tension about immigration and cultural change. The McDonald's location had been chosen specifically for its proximity to Interstate 5 and the border crossing. It served commuters, tourists, border patrol agents, construction workers, families. On a typical Wednesday afternoon in July, the restaurant might have 50 or 60 customers at any given time. Families with children, elderly regulars who came daily for coffee and conversation. Workers on lunch breaks. It was a microcosm of working-class America. Diverse and busy, and utterly ordinary. That ordinariness was about to be shattered by a man who'd concluded that society had failed him. That his personal economic disaster justified mass murder. That killing strangers in a fast food restaurant would somehow make sense of his collapsing life. James Huberty had been planning this for weeks, had told his wife what he intended to do, had said goodbye to his daughters as if they'd never see him again. And no one had stopped him. No one had intervened. No one had recognized that a paranoid, angry man with access to firearms was about to commit the deadliest mass shooting in American history up to that point. James Oliver Huberty was 41 years old in July 1984. Though his appearance suggested someone older, worn down by disappointment and rage. 5 feet 11 inches tall, 230 pounds, heavyset from stress eating and sedentary lifestyle. His hands were large and rough, scarred from years of manual labor before he retrained as a welder. A permanent scowl marked his face, the kind of expression that becomes default after years of bitterness. His eyes were cold, pale blue, empty of empathy or connection. Born October 11, 1942, in Canton, Ohio, James grew up in a working-class family during the prosperous post-World War II era. His mother abandoned the family when he was young, leaving him with a father who was emotionally distant and often absent. Young James was socially awkward, had few friends, was bullied at school for his odd mannerisms and intense personality. He retreated into books and solitary hobbies, building a rich inner life that had little connection to external reality. His childhood was marked by instability and neglect. His father remarried multiple times, each stepmother temporary and uninterested in forming bonds with James. He moved frequently, changing schools, never establishing lasting relationships. By adolescence, he developed a worldview that was paranoid and hostile, convinced that others were always plotting against him, that society was fundamentally corrupt and hostile to people like him. He'd married Etna Huberty in 1965, a woman as socially isolated as himself. They had 2 daughters, Zelia and Cassandra, and moved frequently, James chasing job opportunities and always finding reasons why each situation failed. He'd worked as a welder, as a security guard, in various manual labor positions, never satisfied. Always convinced his employers were incompetent or cheating him, the family moved to Tijuana, Mexico, in 1983 after James lost another job. They lived there for several months, while James worked sporadically and complained constantly about Mexican corruption and crime. By late 1983, they'd moved back to the United States, settling in an apartment in San Ysidro. James found work as a security guard, but he was fired in late 1983 for his aggressive behavior and paranoid accusations against co-workers. Every morning in San Ysidro, James Huberty woke late, usually around 10, and immediately began ruminating on his grievances. He'd lost his job, was unemployed with minimal prospects, living on Etna's income from occasional babysitting and dwindling savings. He'd sit at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, working himself into a rage about how society had failed him, how he'd worked hard all his life and had nothing to show for it. He'd applied for numerous jobs in early 1984, always convinced that he was more qualified than whoever got hired instead. He blamed affirmative action, blamed Mexican immigrants, blamed incompetent bosses, blamed everyone except himself for his unemployment. His paranoia intensified. He became convinced that people were following him, that the government was monitoring him, that conspiracies were working to destroy his life. What James Huberty valued most wasn't family connection, wasn't building something positive, wasn't creating meaning through relationships or community. Though he had a wife and daughters who depended on him, what he valued was his own sense of grievance, his identity as a victim of societal injustice, his rage at a world that he felt had cheated him. His grandfather had been a farmer who'd lost his land during the Depression, a story James retold constantly as evidence that the world was fundamentally unfair. His father had worked in factories that eventually closed, another data point in James's narrative of victimization. The firearms themselves had cost him hundreds of dollars he couldn't afford. A 9mm Browning high-power pistol, an Uzi carbine, and a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun. He'd bought them legally, passed background checks, because in 1984, the gun laws were minimal, and his mental health issues had never resulted in involuntary commitment or criminal conviction. Those weapons represented everything to James: his masculinity, his power, his ability to force the world to acknowledge his existence. By July 1984, James Huberty had concluded that his life was over. He was unemployed with no prospects, living in a tiny apartment, supported by his wife's meager income, approaching middle age with nothing to show for it. His paranoid worldview had convinced him that society had deliberately destroyed him, that enemies were everywhere, that there was no path forward except violence. He'd decided to commit mass murder, to kill as many people as possible before police killed him, to go out in a blaze of violence that would at least make people remember his name. The victims of the San Ysidro McDonald'S massacre weren't a coherent group, weren't connected by anything except their presence in a fast food restaurant on a Wednesday afternoon. They were children and elderly, teenagers and middle-aged adults, Mexican nationals and American citizens, employees earning minimum wage and customers treating their families to lunch. Their only shared characteristic was being in the wrong place when a madman decided to start killing. The employees working that shift represented the American working class in all its diversity and struggle. They were mostly young, many still in high school, earning minimum wage of $3.35 per hour. Some were supporting families, working multiple jobs, using McDonald's as one income stream among several. Others were getting their first job experience, saving for college or cars, learning customer service skills, while dealing with demanding customers and strict management. Among the customers were families who'd come for happy meals and playground time. Parents working multiple jobs who saw McDonald's as affordable family entertainment, a place where kids could burn energy on the playground while adults could sit for 30 minutes without spending much money. Elderly regulars who came daily for coffee and conversation, making fast food restaurants their social clubs because they couldn't afford anything else, and the air conditioning was reliable. There were border workers on lunch breaks, men who'd been standing in the sun processing vehicles since early morning, looking for a quick meal before returning to their posts. There were construction workers, retail employees, people grabbing food between shifts or errands. There were Mexican nationals who'd crossed the border for shopping, treating the trip as a day excursion, planning to return to Tijuana by evening. 8-year-old Carlos Reyes was there with his father, celebrating good grades with a happy meal. He wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up, had a collection of toy fire trucks at home, was excited about starting 3rd grade in the fall. His father Hugo worked 2 jobs, in construction during the day and as a janitor at night, barely seeing his son except on days off like this Wednesday. 11-year-old David Flores was there with his aunt, getting lunch before going to the beach. He was visiting San Diego for summer vacation, living with relatives while his mother worked in Mexico. He loved baseball, played in a youth league in Tijuana, dreamed of becoming a professional player. His aunt had promised him McDonald's and then an afternoon at the beach. A perfect summer day that would never be completed. 18-year-old Blythe Rieger was working her shift, having started at McDonald's 2 months earlier. She was saving for college, planning to study nursing, working full-time over summer break. She was friendly and efficient, popular with regular customers, the kind of employee who smiled genuinely and remembered people's orders. She'd been scheduled to leave at 2 p.m., but had agreed to stay later to cover for a sick coworker. 19-year-old Paulina Lopez had worked at the restaurant for 6 months, sending most of her paycheck to family in Mexico. She was the oldest of 7 children, had immigrated legally 3 years earlier, was working toward citizenship while supporting younger siblings. She sent money home for her brother's school supplies, for her grandmother's medication, for her parents' rent. Her dream was to become a teacher, to help other immigrant children succeed in American schools. These weren't statistics, weren't abstract victims. They were people with dreams and families and futures that extended beyond that Wednesday afternoon. Some would survive, wounded physically and psychologically. Others would die, their potential unfulfilled, their families shattered. And the randomness of who lived and who died would haunt survivors and first responders for decades. The arbitrary nature of violence that can't be explained or rationalized. July 18, 1984, started normally for the Huberty family in their small apartment in San Ysidro. James woke late, drank coffee, complained about unemployment and society's unfairness, as he did every morning. But something was different today, a finality in his manner that Etna couldn't quite identify, but found disturbing. Around 10 a.m., James told Etna he was having mental health problems and needed to see a doctor. This was unusual. James rarely acknowledged any personal issues, always blamed external forces for his problems. Etna called the mental health clinic at the nearby hospital, left a message asking for someone to call back about getting James an appointment. No one returned the call that day. The clinic was understaffed and overbooked. One more systemic failure in a chain that would end in mass murder. James spent the morning cleaning and organizing his weapons. The 9mm Browning pistol, the Uzi carbine, the Winchester shotgun. He loaded magazines, organized ammunition, checked each weapon methodically. Etna saw him doing this, but didn't understand the significance. Didn't realize he was preparing for mass murder. He'd always been obsessive about his guns. She'd learned to ignore it as one of his odd hobbies. Around 2 p.m., James told Etna and their daughters that he was going hunting. Etna asked what he meant, and James replied, "I'm going hunting for humans." Etna later claimed she thought he was joking, that his dark humor had always included inappropriate statements, that she didn't take the comment literally. But some part of her knew, some instinct recognized that this was different, that James was saying goodbye in his own twisted way. James kissed his daughters, told them he loved them, and left the apartment carrying a bag containing his 3 firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He walked out into the July heat, temperature already climbing toward 90 degrees, and walked the short distance to the McDonald's at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard. It was approximately 3:40 p.m. when he arrived. The lunch rush over, but dinner rush not yet started. Maybe 50 or 60 people in the restaurant. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking at the building, the golden arches, the families going in and out. Some witnesses later reported that he seemed calm, almost peaceful, as if he'd made a decision and accepted its consequences. He chambered rounds in his weapons, picked up his bag, and walked toward the entrance dot at the McDonald's. The afternoon was proceeding normally. Blythe Rieger was working the counter, taking orders, making change, smiling at customers. Paulina Lopez was working the grill, preparing burgers and fries. The manager was in the office, doing paperwork. Approximately 45 customers were in the dining area, eating, talking. Kids playing in the small playground area. Carlos Reyes and his father Hugo were at a table near the window. Carlos eating his happy meal, playing with the toy that came with it. David Flores and his aunt were near the back, finishing their meals, planning their beach trip. Elderly couples were scattered at various tables, nursing coffee, reading newspapers, enjoying the air conditioning and company. Everything was ordinary, mundane, a typical Wednesday afternoon at a fast food restaurant. Then James Huberty walked through the door, carrying his weapons. And ordinary ended. He didn't announce himself, didn't make demands, didn't give any warning. He simply started shooting, systematically, methodically, executing everyone he could see. The massacre had begun. At 3:56 p.m. on July 18, 1984, James Oliver Huberty pushed open the glass door of the McDonald's at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard and immediately raised the Browning high-power pistol. His first shots were directed at the ceiling, two loud reports that caused instantaneous pandemonium. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening, a sharp crack followed by echoes bouncing off tile floors and walls. Every person in the restaurant froze for a split second. That moment of confusion when the brain tries to process whether that sound was a gunshot or a car backfiring or something dropping. Then Huberty lowered the pistol and shot a man standing near the entrance. Confusion turned to terror. People screamed. Children cried. Customers dove under tables, scrambled toward exits, tried to shield loved ones with their own bodies. Employees behind the counter dropped to the floor or ran toward the kitchen. The instinct was to flee, to hide, to get away from the shooter who'd appeared without warning. But Huberty had positioned himself strategically. He stood near the main entrance with clear sight lines throughout the dining area. Anyone trying to escape past him would have to run directly into his line of fire. The kitchen offered the only other exit, and he'd soon move to block that route as well. He'd created a kill zone, and everyone inside was trapped. His first victim was a man who'd been standing near the counter, waiting to order. Huberty shot him multiple times in the back as he tried to run. The man, later identified as David Flores Sr., fell near the door, bleeding out on the floor in front of his horrified son. Huberty stepped over the body and continued shooting, methodical and calm, selecting targets and eliminating them with practiced efficiency. A woman named Elsa Hernandez was near the entrance with her 3 children when the shooting started. She tried to gather her kids and run for the door, but Huberty shot her multiple times, killing her almost instantly. Her children, ages 8 months, 2 years, and 4 years, survived by hiding under their dead mother's body for the next 77 minutes, covered in her blood. Too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to be traumatized permanently by the experience. Carlos, Reyes, and his father Hugo were at a table near the window. Carlos still playing with his Happy Meal toy when the shooting started. Hugo's instinct was immediate and primal: protect his son at all costs. He threw himself over Carlos, covering the 8-year-old boy with his own body, hoping that if Huberty shot at them, he'd take the bullets instead of his child. Huberty approached their table, rifle now in hand, and shot Hugo multiple times through the back. The bullets passed through Hugo and struck Carlos beneath him. Both father and son died within minutes. Carlos's last moments spent trapped beneath his dead father's weight, dying from the same bullets that had killed Hugo. The Happy Meal remained on the table, untouched. The toy fire truck still clutched in Carlos's small hand. 11-year-old David Flores was with his Aunt Maria when the shooting erupted. Maria grabbed David's hand and ran toward the door, hoping to escape before Huberty could target them. They made it almost to the exit before Huberty shot Maria in the back. She fell forward, and David, still holding her hand, fell with her. Huberty shot David twice as he lay on the floor next to his dying aunt. The boy who dreamed of becoming a baseball player died 8 feet from the exit, close enough to safety that he could see the parking lot through the glass doors, but too far to reach it. Behind the counter, the McDonald's employees faced impossible choices: run and risk being shot in the back, hide and hope Huberty wouldn't find them. fight and certainly die. Most chose to hide, crouching behind equipment, crawling into storage areas, pressing themselves into corners, and praying the shooter would overlook them. Blythe Rieger, the 18-year-old who'd been saving for college, tried to run toward the kitchen exit. Huberty saw her movement and shot her multiple times with the Uzi carbine. The automatic weapon fired rapidly, bullet after bullet striking Blythe and throwing her against the kitchen equipment. She died instantly, her body falling near the grill, her blood mixing with hot grease that had spilled during the chaos. Paulina Lopez, 19 years old, who sent most of her paycheck to family in Mexico, tried to hide behind the grill. Huberty came behind the counter, methodically checking every hiding spot, shooting anyone he found. He discovered Paulina and shot her at point-blank range with the shotgun. The blast threw her onto the hot grill surfaces, where she died from gunshot wounds compounded by severe burns. Her family in Mexico wouldn't learn of her death for days, kept waiting by bureaucratic delays in identifying and notifying next of kin across international borders. The manager, a man named Neva Kane, was in the office when the shooting started. He heard the first shots, understood immediately what was happening, and called 911. His voice on the emergency call, later released to media, captured the terror and disbelief. "There's a man with a gun shooting everyone in the restaurant. We need help now. People are dying." A 911 operator kept him on the line, gathering information, dispatching police, while Kane listened to gunshots and screaming from the dining area. Huberty shot continuously for the first 5 minutes, working through the dining area systematically. He'd shoot people under tables, people trying to hide behind chairs, people pressed against walls, hoping he wouldn't see them. Some victims were shot once and left to bleed out. Others were shot multiple times, Huberty ensuring they were dead before moving to the next target. His ammunition capacity was enormous, hundreds of rounds distributed across multiple weapons, ensuring he could maintain fire for extended periods without RELOADING. An elderly couple named Miguel and Aida Ulloa were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, drinking coffee and reading newspapers as they did every Wednesday afternoon. They were regulars, came at the same time each week, knew the staff by name. When the shooting started, Miguel tried to shield Aida, but both were shot before they could even stand from their chairs. Miguel died immediately. Aida lingered for several minutes, calling Miguel's name, before bleeding out on the floor beside him. Jackie Wright was working the drive-through window when Huberty entered. She heard shots from the dining area and made a split-second decision that saved her life: run out the back door immediately. She sprinted through the kitchen, crashed through the emergency exit, and kept running across the parking lot while bullets whistled past her. She survived without physical injury, but with psychological trauma that would require decades of therapy to partially address. By 4:01 p.m., approximately 5 minutes after the shooting started, most victims were already dead or wounded. Huberty had shot more than 30 people in the time it would take to order and eat a Big Mac. The restaurant floor was covered in blood. Bodies sprawled across tables and floors, wounded people moaning or crying for help that wouldn't come. The smell was overwhelming. Gunpowder, blood, the acrid scent of spent cartridges, and the biological odors of death and trauma. But Huberty wasn't finished. Having cleared the interior of the restaurant, he moved to the windows and began shooting at people outside. A woman named Lydia Diaz was sitting in her car in the parking lot, waiting for her husband, who'd gone into the restaurant to order food. Huberty shot through her windshield, killing her instantly. Her husband emerged from the restaurant moments later, having hidden successfully during the interior shooting, only to find his wife dead in their car. Pedestrians walking on San Ysidro Boulevard were targeted randomly. Huberty shot at anyone visible through the windows, treating them like targets in a shooting gallery. Some pedestrians were hit and wounded, others missed by inches. One man was shot in the leg as he walked past the restaurant. Having no idea there was a mass shooting in progress until the bullet struck him, and he saw Huberty through the window, leveling a rifle at him. Police arrived at 4:01 p.m., just 5 minutes after the first 911 call. Officer Rosario Claros was first on scene, responding to the call of shots fired at a fast food restaurant. She had no idea what she was driving into, no tactical briefing or preparation, just the address and the report of possible shooting. When she arrived and saw bodies visible through the windows, realized people were being shot actively. She radioed for backup and SWAT, and every available unit in the city. Huberty saw the police car and immediately began shooting at it. Officer Claros took cover behind her vehicle, returned fire with her service pistol, but she was outgunned completely. Her 9mm pistol against Huberty's rifles and shotgun was no contest. She couldn't advance, couldn't enter the restaurant, couldn't do anything except establish perimeter and wait for tactical units with appropriate firepower. More police arrived within minutes, surrounding the McDonald's, evacuating nearby businesses and homes, establishing command post, and beginning the process of organizing a tactical response. But they faced an unprecedented situation. Active shooter with superior firepower and elevated position. Dozens of potential hostages and wounded victims inside needing immediate medical attention. No clear shot opportunity and extreme risk to officers who attempted entry. The tactical problem was enormous. Standard police procedure for active shooters in 1984 was to establish perimeter and wait for SWAT. But while police waited, victims inside were bleeding out, dying from survivable wounds because medical attention was impossible. Every minute of delay cost lives, but rushing in recklessly might cost police lives while failing to save victims. The commanders faced an impossible choice: act quickly and risk failure, or wait for proper resources and watch victims die. Inside the restaurant, survivors were making their own impossible choices. Play dead and hope Huberty didn't check whether bodies were actually deceased. Try to render aid to wounded and risk being shot yourself. Crawl toward exits during moments when Huberty wasn't watching and maybe escape or maybe be killed in the attempt. Every choice was a gamble with death as the stakes. 14-year-old boy named Jose Cano had been in the restaurant with his sister when the shooting started. They'd both hidden under a table when the first shots were fired. Jose watched Huberty shoot his sister, saw her die 6 feet away from him, and made the decision to remain motionless, to play dead, to not cry or scream or show any sign of life. He lay under that table for the next 70 minutes, his sister's body nearby. Huberty periodically walking past close enough that Jose could have touched him, certain that any movement would mean death. The siege phase began around 4:10 p.m. Huberty had killed everyone he could see, wounded many others, and now controlled the restaurant from his position near the windows. He shot periodically at movement outside, at police vehicles, at anyone visible in neighboring businesses. He seemed content to wait, to hold his position, to prolong the situation as long as possible. Some survivors later speculated that he was enjoying it, that the massacre had given him the sense of power and control that his life had always lacked. Police negotiators arrived and attempted to establish communication, using bullhorns to call out to Huberty. But he showed no interest in negotiation. He didn't respond to offers, didn't make demands, didn't engage in dialogue. He just maintained his position and occasionally shot at anyone who appeared in his sight line. The negotiators had nothing to work with, no leverage, no pathway to peaceful resolution. The SWAT team arrived at 4:30 p.m., 34 minutes into the massacre. They immediately began tactical planning, surveying the building, identifying potential entry points. positioning snipers on nearby rooftops. The plan was developing. Wait for clear shot opportunity. Eliminate the threat with precision sniper fire. No negotiated surrender. No tactical assault risking officer casualties. Just ended cleanly and quickly with one well-placed shot. But getting that shot proved difficult. Huberty moved constantly, never presenting a clear target for more than a second or two. He'd appear at one window, then move to another, keeping police guessing about his position. The snipers tracked him, followed his movements, prepared for the moment when he'd be still long enough for a shot with certainty of hitting and killing on first round. Inside, the wounded were dying. A woman named Aurora Pina had been shot in the abdomen and was bleeding internally. She could have survived with immediate medical treatment, but trapped in the restaurant with no aid available. She bled out over the course of 45 minutes. Conscious and aware she was dying, unable to do anything except wait for death. Her husband survived uninjured, watched her die, could do nothing to save her. A 15-year-old boy named Omar Hernandez had been shot in the leg, a painful but non-fatal wound. He applied pressure to stop bleeding, tried to keep quiet to avoid attracting Huberty's attention, prayed that police would end the situation before he bled out. He survived by using his belt as a tourniquet, tying it above the wound, enduring the pain while remaining silent. He'd later lose his leg below the knee due to vascular damage from the bullet and the extended time without proper treatment. But at least he lived. The media arrived and began broadcasting live coverage. Helicopters circling overhead, cameras filming the McDonald's from every angle. The whole nation was watching as police struggled to resolve the situation. Pressure mounted to act, to do something, to end the massacre and rescue the survivors. But rushing in blind would likely result in dead officers and no improvement for victims. The commanders held firm. Wait for the shot, do it right. End it with precision rather than chaos. At 5:05 p.m., more than an hour into the massacre, Huberty was still active, still shooting periodically, still in complete control of the situation. 21 people were already dead inside the restaurant. 19 were wounded, some critically. Police had established complete perimeter, evacuated surrounding areas, positioned snipers and tactical teams. But still no clear shot opportunity, still no way to end it without unacceptable risk. Then at 5:17 p.m., Huberty made a mistake. He stood near the window, lowered his rifle for a moment, remained still for approximately 3 seconds while surveying the scene outside. SWAT sniper Chuck Foster, positioned on the post office roof with clear sight line through the window, had been waiting for this exact moment for 45 minutes. He took the shot. The bullet from Chuck Foster's Remington 700 traveled approximately 200 feet from the post office roof to the McDonald's window in a fraction of a second. It struck James Huberty in the chest, penetrating his heart and causing massive internal damage. Huberty dropped instantly, the rifle falling from his hands, his body collapsing near the window where he'd been standing. For the first time in 77 minutes, the shooting stopped. Foster radioed confirmation of the hit, but protocol required verification before tactical entry. SWAT teams watched through scopes and windows, confirming that Huberty wasn't moving, that his weapons were out of reach, that there was no indication of additional shooters. After approximately 3 minutes of observation, the decision was made to enter and secure the building. At 5:20 p.m., SWAT teams made tactical entry through multiple doors simultaneously. They moved through the restaurant with weapons raised, checking every corner, every hiding spot, every potential threat location. They found Huberty's body near the window, confirmed he was dead, secured his weapons. Then they began the grim process of assessing the carnage and locating survivors. The scene inside the McDonald's was beyond anything the tactical officers had trained for or imagined. Bodies everywhere, some obviously dead, others possibly alive, but too wounded to move or speak. Blood covering floors and walls, shell casings scattered across every surface, a smell of death overwhelming even for experienced officers. Several SWAT members vomited outside after their initial entry. Overwhelmed by the scope of horror inside, the first priority was locating and evacuating survivors. Officers called out, asking anyone alive to identify themselves, to move if possible, to make noise so they could be found. Slowly, survivors emerged from hiding spots. Jose Cano crawled out from under the table where he'd hidden for 77 minutes next to his dead sister. The Hernandez children emerged from under their mother's body, covered in her blood, too traumatized to speak. Others revealed themselves from behind counters, from storage areas, from corners where they'd pressed themselves hoping to be overlooked. 19 wounded victims were identified and triaged. Paramedics entered and began providing emergency treatment, stopping bleeding, stabilizing critical injuries, preparing victims for transport. The wounded were evacuated in waves, the most critical first, rushed to nearby hospitals where trauma surgeons were standing by. Some victims had been shot and hiding for more than an hour, bleeding slowly, going into shock. Their survival dependent on immediate treatment that had been impossible while Huberty remained active. 21 dead remained inside the restaurant. The bodies couldn't be moved immediately. Crime scene protocol required photographing and documenting everything before disturbing evidence. So the dead lay where they'd fallen while investigators processed the scene, a grim task that would take hours. Medical examiners would eventually identify each victim, document cause of death, collect ballistics evidence, build the comprehensive forensic record that would be needed for investigation and thus potential litigation. The families of victims began gathering outside the police perimeter. Having heard news reports, having recognized the location, desperate for information about loved ones, police established a family reunification center at a nearby recreation center, where relatives could check whether their family members were among the survivors or the dead. The process was chaotic and traumatic, families learning of deaths through official notification, survivors reuniting with worried relatives, the grief and relief mingling in ways that created complex emotional trauma. The media coverage was extensive and immediate. News helicopters had been circling throughout the siege. Cameras had captured the final sniper shot, the tactical entry, the evacuation of survivors. The images would be broadcast nationwide within hours, bringing the San Ysidro massacre into American homes and creating a national conversation about gun violence, mental health, and public safety that would prove largely ineffective at preventing future mass shootings. The immediate investigation began while bodies still remained inside the restaurant. Detectives interviewed survivors, collected witness statements, documented the crime scene with photographs and diagrams. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of shell casings, 3 weapons, blood evidence linking specific victims to specific bullets, trajectory analysis showing where Huberty had been positioned when he fired each shot. But understanding the physical evidence was simpler than understanding the why. What drives a man to massacre strangers in a fast food restaurant? Edna Huberty was located at the apartment in San Ysidro and informed that her husband had committed mass murder before being killed by police. She was questioned extensively about James's mental state, about the going hunting for humans comment, about whether she'd seen warning signs or had opportunities to prevent the massacre. Her statements were confused and defensive. She'd been a victim of James's psychological abuse for years, had learned to tune out his rants and threats as survival mechanism, genuinely hadn't understood the literalness of his final statement. The Huberty daughters, Zelia and Cassandra, were devastated by learning their father was a mass murderer. They'd said goodbye to him that afternoon, not knowing it was permanent, not understanding that when he said he loved them was a final statement before committing an atrocity that would define their lives forever. They would grow up as the daughters of one of America's most infamous mass shooters, carrying shame and grief and confusion about how to remember a father who'd loved them but murdered children just like them. The Mexican consulate in San Diego was contacted to handle the 8 Mexican national victims, families who'd crossed the border for a day trip and never returned home. The diplomatic complications were significant. Mexican government officials expressing outrage that their citizens had been murdered due to American gun violence, demanding action to prevent future incidents. The massacre strained U.S.-Mexico relations at a moment when border issues were already contentious, adding another layer of complexity to an already tragic situation. By midnight on July 18th, 12 hours after the massacre began, the crime scene was still being processed. The bodies had been removed to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The wounded were in hospitals, some in critical condition, all facing long recoveries, physical and psychological. The survivors who'd escaped physical injury were beginning the process of coming to terms with what they'd witnessed, starting the psychological journey that would last decades. The McDonald's Corporation issued a statement expressing condolences and promising cooperation with investigators. Privately, corporate executives were already discussing what to do with the location, whether it could reopen, whether customers would ever return to a restaurant where mass murder had occurred. The financial considerations were secondary to public relations concerns, the company understanding that how they handled the aftermath would affect the McDonald's brand nationally. Local religious leaders organized vigils and memorial services, providing spaces for community grief and processing. Churches were filled with mourners, many of whom hadn't known victims personally, but felt connected through shared community and horror at what had happened in their neighborhood. The vigils provided some comfort, but couldn't answer the fundamental questions. Why did this happen? How could it have been prevented? What do we do now to ensure it never happens again? The investigation would continue for months, generating thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, forensic analysis, and psychological assessment. But the basic facts were already clear. James Huberty had committed premeditated mass murder, killing 21 people and wounding 19 others, before being killed by police sniper fire after a 77-minute massacre. Understanding those facts would prove easier than understanding the meaning of them or learning lessons that might prevent future tragedies. Asterisk. The final death toll was devastating. 21 killed, including the shooter. 19 wounded. Multiple crime scenes across several blocks. The youngest victim was 8 months old, an infant shot in the arms while his mother tried to protect him. The oldest was 74, an elderly woman who'd come for coffee and ended up dying in a pool of blood. 8 victims were children under age 18. Many victims were Mexican nationals, families who'd crossed the border for a day trip and never made it home. The names of the dead would be released over the following days, each one representing a life ended, a family shattered, potential unrealized. Carlos Reyes, age 8. David Flores, age 11. Blythe Rieger, age 18. Paulina Lopez, age 19. 17 others, ranging from infants to elderly, all killed for no reason except being present when a madman decided to start shooting. The investigation into the San Ysidro McDonald'S massacre was both straightforward and complex. The basic facts were undisputed. James Oliver Huberty had walked into a fast food restaurant and systematically murdered everyone he could, continuing for 77 minutes until killed by police sniper. His motives were documented in statements to his wife, in his psychiatric history, in the planning, evident from his weapon selection and tactical approach. This wasn't a mystery requiring solving. It was a tragedy requiring understanding. But understanding proved elusive. What combination of factors creates a mass shooter? How do you prevent someone like Huberty from acting on murderous impulses? What systemic changes would actually work to stop future massacres? The investigation could document what happened, but struggled to provide answers that would prevent future occurrences. Huberty's psychological history was examined in exhaustive detail by multiple forensic psychiatrists. His childhood abandonment by his mother created attachment issues and difficulty forming emotional connections. His father's emotional distance and multiple failed remarriages reinforced feelings of unworthiness and isolation. His social awkwardness and inability to maintain friendships created a feedback loop where isolation bred more isolation, where lack of social skills prevented him from developing the connections that might have provided meaning and prevented violence. His work history showed a pattern of perceived persecution and actual failure. He'd been fired from multiple jobs, always blaming employers or coworkers rather than examining his own behavior. His paranoid personality made him impossible to work with, convinced that everyone was conspiring against him, unable to accept feedback or admit mistakes. Each job loss reinforced his worldview that society was fundamentally unjust and hostile to people like him. The move to Tijuana and back to San Ysidro represented Huberty's pattern of geographic solutions to psychological problems. He believed that moving to a new location would solve his issues, that the problems were environmental rather than internal. When Mexico didn't provide the fresh start he'd imagined, when he returned to the United States and still couldn't find success, the last escape valve closed. He was trapped in San Ysidro, unemployed, living on his wife's minimal income. Approaching middle age with nothing to show for it, mental health professionals who reviewed Huberty's case concluded he'd been suffering from paranoid personality disorder, possibly paranoid schizophrenia, definitely some form of major mental illness that impaired his judgment and reality testing. But he'd never been involuntarily committed, never been diagnosed or treated formally, never entered any system that might have documented his condition and potentially prevented gun purchases. The phone call Etna made to the mental health clinic the morning of the massacre became a focal point for questions about preventability. If the clinic had called back promptly, if Huberty had been seen by a psychiatrist that day, could the massacre have been prevented? Possibly, though also possibly not. One psychiatric appointment rarely results in involuntary commitment, and Huberty was skilled at hiding his most violent thoughts from outsiders. He might have presented as depressed or anxious rather than homicidal, might have been prescribed medication and sent home, might have committed the massacre anyway, but the failure to return the call represented a systemic problem. The mental health clinic was understaffed and overbooked, serving a low-income community with minimal resources. They had waiting lists weeks long, couldn't accommodate urgent cases promptly, operated on the edge of crisis constantly. Etna's call was one of dozens they received daily, and without specific threats of imminent harm, it wasn't prioritized. This wasn't individual negligence. It was systemic failure, built into an underfunded mental health system that couldn't serve the population's needs. The weapons investigation was simpler, legally, but more complicated politically. All 3 firearms Huberty used were legally purchased. He'd passed background checks, had no criminal record, or documented mental health commitment that would prohibit ownership. In 1984, gun laws were minimal, focused primarily on preventing felons and formally adjudicated mentally ill individuals from purchasing weapons. Huberty fit neither category, so he could buy an arsenal legally. The Browning high-power 9mm pistol had been purchased at a gun shop in Tijuana, Mexico, then brought across the border illegally. The Uzi carbine and Winchester shotgun were purchased legally in Ohio before the family moved to California. All 3 weapons were functioning properly, had been maintained carefully, were loaded with appropriate ammunition. The investigation documented the legal purchase trail, but found no violations of existing law, just a system that allowed a paranoid, potentially psychotic man to legally arm himself with weapons capable of mass murder. The civil litigation that followed was extensive and complex. Survivors and families of victims sued McDonald's Corporation, arguing that the restaurant's design and security measures were inadequate, that the company had a duty to protect customers from foreseeable violence, that negligence had contributed to the death toll. The lawsuits sought millions in damages for wrongful death, personal injury, and psychological trauma. McDonald's defense was straightforward. No reasonable security measures could have prevented a determined shooter with military weapons. Requiring fast food restaurants to be fortresses would be impractical and economically impossible. And the company had no legal duty to protect customers from mass shooters. They argued that Huberty was solely responsible, that his actions were unforeseeable and unpreventable, that assigning liability to McDonald's would create an impossible standard for all public businesses. The courts largely agreed with McDonald's position. Businesses aren't liable for criminal acts by third parties unless those acts are foreseeable and preventable through reasonable security measures. Mass shootings in 1984 were still relatively rare. Huberty had no prior connection to the restaurant that might have created duty to exclude him, and no security guard or metal detector would have stopped a man determined to commit mass murder. Most cases were settled confidentially for undisclosed amounts, with McDonald's paying some compensation while admitting no legal liability. Families also attempted to sue Etna Huberty, arguing she'd enabled the massacre by failing to stop James from leaving the apartment with weapons after he'd stated his intentions to go hunting for humans. This litigation raised profound questions about family members' duties to prevent crimes, about whether spouses can be held liable for failing to report threats, about what constitutes reasonable action when living with an abusive, potentially violent person. The courts struggled with these questions. Etna had been a victim of James's psychological abuse for years, had learned that contradicting or challenging him resulted in escalation and violence, had developed coping mechanisms that included ignoring or minimizing his threats as survival strategy. Should she have known this threat was literal rather than his typical dark humor? Should she have called police despite fearing James's reaction? Could she reasonably have physically prevented him from leaving with weapons when he outweighed her significantly and had history of violence toward family members? Ultimately, most claims against Etna were dismissed. Courts found that she'd been a victim herself, that imposing liability would effectively punish domestic abuse victims for not preventing their abusers' crimes, that the legal duty to prevent third-party crimes is limited even for family members. She received some settlement payments from McDonald's litigation as James's widow and mother of his children, and used those funds to relocate and rebuild her life away from San Ysidro and its memories. The police response was reviewed extensively by internal affairs and outside consultants. The 77-minute duration raised questions about whether police could have acted faster, could have entered the restaurant earlier, could have saved more victims with more aggressive tactics. But the review largely vindicated the police response as appropriate given the circumstances. Initial officers were outgunned and couldn't advance safely. SWAT arrived as quickly as possible. The sniper shot that ended the massacre required positioning and opportunity that took time to develop. Rushing in recklessly would likely have resulted in dead officers without saving additional victims. The one criticism was that 1984 police training for active shooter situations was inadequate, focused on perimeter and containment rather than rapid intervention. The San Ysidro massacre and other incidents in the 1980s and 1990s would eventually drive changes in police tactics, with departments training officers to immediately engage active shooters rather than waiting for SWAT. But in 1984, the police response was consistent with standard protocols of the era. Response to the massacre was limited and largely ineffective. Some jurisdictions passed new gun control measures, creating waiting periods, enhancing background checks, restricting certain types of weapons. But federal action was blocked by the gun rights lobby, and California's efforts were focused more on symbolic gestures than effective prevention. The Brady Bill wouldn't pass until 1993, the federal assault weapons ban not until 1994, and both had limited effectiveness at preventing mass shootings. Mental health advocates pushed for reforms, for better access to treatment, for systems to identify potentially dangerous individuals before they acted, for involuntary commitment criteria that would capture people like Huberty before they murdered. But reforms were underfunded and incomplete. The same gaps that had allowed Huberty to go untreated remained largely in place for future mass shooters. The mental health system remained understaffed and under-resourced, unable to serve the population's needs, continuing to fail people in crisis until their crisis became violent. The McDonald's Corporation made a difficult decision about the restaurant. After extensive internal debate and community consultation, they decided the building couldn't remain a functioning restaurant. The location was demolished in September 1984, just 2 months after the massacre. The company donated the land to the city of San Ysidro, which built a small memorial park called the Southwest Community Park. The park includes playground equipment, benches, and a memorial listing the names of the 21 victims who died that July day. A new McDonald's was built nearby, far enough from the massacre site that customers wouldn't constantly be reminded of the tragedy, close enough that the franchise could continue serving the community. The new location thrived despite the shadow of history, people choosing to remember the good things about McDonald's, the jobs it provided, and the service it offered, rather than dwelling on the day when one madman turned a restaurant into a killing field. The investigation officially closed in early 1985, having determined that James Huberty was solely responsible for the massacre, that he'd acted alone without accomplices, that his motives were rooted in mental illness and paranoid delusions about society's persecution of him. No criminal charges were filed against anyone except Huberty, who was deceased. No system failures rose to the level of criminal negligence. The report documented what happened, identified some areas for improvement in mental health services and police response, but provided no roadmap for preventing future mass shootings. The victims' families received varying amounts of compensation through settlements with McDonald's and other sources. Some received hundreds of thousands of dollars, others much less, depending on the strength of their cases and their willingness to litigate. The money couldn't bring back the dead or heal the trauma, but it provided some financial security for families who'd lost breadwinners or incurred massive medical bills treating wounded survivors. For many families, the financial compensation was less important than the symbolic acknowledgement that their loved ones' deaths mattered. That society recognized the loss, even if it couldn't prevent or adequately punish it. Because Huberty died during the massacre, there was no criminal trial to determine guilt or sentence a defendant. The investigation concluded he was solely responsible, acting alone with no accomplices or co-conspirators. The case closed with Huberty's death, leaving survivors and families without the catharsis that trials sometimes provide. But civil litigation followed. Families of victims sued McDonald's Corporation, arguing the restaurant's design had contributed to the death toll. Large windows had given Huberty clear sightlines. Limited exits had trapped victims inside. Security measures were non-existent, despite the restaurant being in a high-crime area near the border. The lawsuits sought damages for wrongful death and negligence. McDonald's settled most cases confidentially, paying undisclosed amounts to families while admitting no liability. The corporation argued that no reasonable security measures could have prevented a determined shooter with military weapons, that requiring fast food restaurants to be fortresses would be impractical and unnecessary. Courts generally agreed finding that McDonald's had no legal duty to protect customers from mass shooters. Families also sued Huberty's estate, though he died with minimal assets. Edna Huberty faced lawsuits, arguing she'd enabled the massacre by not preventing James from leaving the apartment with weapons after he'd stated his intentions. Courts struggled with this question. What duty does a family member have to prevent crimes when threatened with violence themselves? Ultimately, most claims against Edna were dismissed. Courts finding she'd been a victim of James's abuse and couldn't reasonably have stopped him without risking her own life. The legal changes that followed were minimal and mostly ineffective. Some jurisdictions tightened gun laws, created waiting periods, enhanced background checks. But federal action was limited. The gun rights lobby was powerful. And political will to address gun violence was weak in 1984. Massacre changed public conversation about mass shootings, but didn't fundamentally change laws or policies. Mental health advocates pushed for better access to treatment, for systems to identify potentially dangerous individuals before they acted, for involuntary commitment criteria that would capture people like Huberty. But reforms were underfunded and incomplete. The same gaps that had allowed Huberty to go untreated remained largely in place for future mass shooters. 40 years after the San Ysidro McDonald'S massacre, its legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in American violence. For years it held the record as the deadliest mass shooting in American history, until Luby's in 1991. Then others surpassed it as mass shootings became horrifyingly routine. But San Ysidro was among the first. One of the incidents that demonstrated how vulnerable public spaces were to armed individuals intent on maximum casualties. The memorial park that replaced the McDonald's is quiet and well-maintained. A peaceful space with playground equipment and benches. A monument lists the names of the 21 victims. Families still visit, leave flowers, mark anniversaries. The community hasn't forgotten, but most Americans have. San Ysidro is a footnote in the history of mass violence, overshadowed by larger death tolls and more recent tragedies. The survivors who remain in San Ysidro live with permanent scars, physical and psychological. Some still can't enter fast food restaurants, can't hear loud noises without panic, can't watch news coverage of mass shootings without being transported back to that Wednesday afternoon. Their trauma is lifelong, a wound that never fully heals, a burden they carry every day. The question of whether the massacre could have been prevented remains contested. If the mental health clinic had called back, if Edna had called police when James said he was hunting humans, if gun laws had been stricter, if. But dwelling on what might have been doesn't bring back the dead or heal the wounded. It only highlights the many small failures that combine to create tragedy. The uncomfortable truth is that James Huberty was both mentally ill and morally responsible. That he was a victim of societal failures, including inadequate mental health care and economic dislocation, and a perpetrator of horrific violence against innocent people, that both things are true simultaneously. He needed help he didn't receive, professional psychiatric treatment that might have addressed his paranoid delusions and violent ideation. But he also made conscious choices to acquire weapons, to plan an attack, to murder children and families eating lunch at a fast food restaurant. Society failed him through inadequate mental health care, economic insecurity, and social isolation that created conditions for violence. But he failed society far more profoundly through his decision to massacre strangers as revenge for his perceived victimization. Understanding both aspects, the ways he was failed and the ways he failed, is essential to preventing future tragedies while maintaining moral clarity about responsibility for mass murder. The line between mental illness and evil, between victim and perpetrator, between system failure and individual responsibility, between preventable tragedy and unforeseeable catastrophe, that line is thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes, in the darkest moments like that Wednesday afternoon in San Ysidro, it disappears entirely, leaving only bodies on a restaurant floor and questions that resist easy answers about how to build a society that prevents MISS violence while respecting liberty and providing care for those who need it most. The massacre forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American society. That we value gun rights over public safety. That mental health care remains inadequate and inaccessible. That economic insecurity creates desperation that sometimes turns violent. And that we've normalized mass shootings to the point where even tragedies like San Ysidro fade from memory within years. If this story made you think about gun violence, mental health, and the vulnerability of public spaces, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about violence prevention, about warning signs we miss, about how society fails to protect its most vulnerable before they become violent themselves. Comment below. What responsibility does society have to identify and treat potentially violent individuals before they act? What balance between personal freedom and public safety makes sense in a nation with more guns than people and inadequate mental health services? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now in schools and churches and shopping malls where systems fail and mental illness goes untreated until violence is the only outcome. Until next time, remember very clearly that mass shooters aren't born as monsters from birth. Sometimes they're created through neglect, through untreated mental illness, through economic desperation and social isolation that festers until violence seems like the only option. One missed appointment, one ignored warning sign, one legally purchased weapon at a time.